How's everyone doing? Good afternoon officially. It's been a good morning though. Let's do a round of applause. How's your morning been? So, I'm not going to waste any time. You guys are all here. You're in the right place. We are about to hear from Art Wolfe. But I do want to point out that Art will be back in this room at 4 o'clock today with Franz Lanting, having a conversation together and reviewing images. And I'm very excited for that. But this is the best kickoff to start things off. And without further ado, Art Wolfe, please join us on stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh my God, this reminds me of the first time I came to New York. I had visited Washington, D.C. and National Geographic, so I took a train up to Penn Central. This was in the late 70s. And it was like 95 degrees and humid, and coming out of the station, the pervasive smell was pizza, and I nearly fell on my face and passed out. Now it seems like the same thing, so nothing changes. Anyway, listen, what I'm going to talk about today is one of 28 pathways to creativity that I sat down and did during the first 3 months of COVID just to keep myself sane. I don't know whether I was successful at that or not, but this one lecture is really about composition. And it's something that I've been teaching over the years. And if you're interested in this one lecture, then by all means, come to my website and look at the other 27. All right? So composition part one. This is the lecture. And if I get through this really fast, then we can talk. I realize that these screens are rather small for the size of this room, so I'll read this. Photography was more than just the creation of beautiful pictures. It was a way to connect more deeply with the world. And that's Shapiro from the Tao of Photography. This is one of my all-time favorite photos. It was actually photographed on the Ganges in 2001, the year the Trade Center came down. And I remember it so clearly because every morning in Benares or Varanasi, India, the sun was rising identically. And there was maybe 2 or 3 seconds before the sun rose so high in the sky that it was so hot that it just washed out or created a lens flare. And so the night before, I found a pilgrim that was rowing their boat up and down the Ganges, and I asked that they rendezvous with me the next morning before sunrise. And they did. And I pulled the boat up into the mud of the bank and asked them through an interpreter to remain absolutely still. Because this was F-22, it was film, and the exposure was about 1 second in length. So you're really never going to get somebody rowing across a river at 1 second and have any clarity, let alone depth of field. So it was all pre-visualized, pre-planned, and executed. And I love spontaneity. I love just grabbing the shot on the fly, but I also love orchestrating a shot when it turns out successfully. The thing that I admire about that, and I will then move on with the rest of this lecture, is the fact that I forgot whether it was a man or a woman. It was a faceless individual. And therefore, it's easier for us to put ourselves into that boat or into that situation. If there was a recognizable person, then that would kind of overwhelm the moment. So I call this, what do I call this? Spiritual journey. And it had to happen right at that moment the sun was coming up through the haze. And within minutes, it was over. I said thank you, gave the participant a little bit of money, and off he went, or she went. I really don't remember. So defining a subject. You know, I based this entire lecture on the fact that I've been teaching ever since I got out of college in 1977. I started teaching. Whatever I was learning that year, I wanted to share with people other than myself. So I was trained as a teacher. I was trained as a fine art painter. And so the aesthetics of photography, the rules of composition, if you will, all those kind of things got ingrained in my brain, plus years and years of being critiqued by various painting instructors. And eventually during the college years, I got into climbing, and my parents gave me an old Konica camera with no instructions, and I started learning photography. Eventually I got a 4x5 and started photographing mountains, and by the time I graduated from the university, my allegiances had shifted from painting to photography. It was far more easy to create original compositions than trying to conjure up a meaningful painting from a blank canvas. But I look at photos like this, and I've critiqued a lot over the years, and people will show me this photo for critique, and I'll say, okay, tell me about this photo. Well, it's such a beautiful valley. It was up in Bhutan, and I don't know, I just kind of documented it. And I say to them, yeah, but what's your subject? Well, the valley, I think. There's no subject here. That's the point I want to make. You know, for all of us, we don't want people ultimately to be forced to guess what we're shooting. The clearer the content, the easier it is for you to understand what I was after when I took the shot. If you're questioning it, then the communication is really fuzzy. So in a shot like this, there are quite a few shots. Say you're interested in architecture. Well, it's really interesting how the Bhutanese build their structure so solidly out of stone and wood, very similar to what you might find in Switzerland. That's a shot. Now, you may not like that shot, but it's unequivocal. Okay, so maybe you're not into architecture. Maybe religion is something you're interested in. Way up on that hillside, there's a monastery. So zooming in on the monastery, not a great shot, but it's, again, the message is fairly clear what the subject is. Maybe you're only into nature. You don't really want the hand-to-man. So zooming in on a long exposure of rapids, blurred motion against the hard edge of rocks could be a subject. Okay, is that it? No. Maybe you're into abstract and textures. Yeah, this photo basically sucks, but you know, I'm not gonna, I'm making a point, okay? Surely that must be the end of this. But no, in Bhutan, they have this great cultural element of prayer flags. And so prayer flags are ubiquitous around villages and monasteries. And the whole idea of a prayer flag is they inscribe these delicate fabrics with prayers from the Buddhist religion. And as it's buffeted relentlessly by the winds of the Himalayas, it disintegrates and therefore scatters the prayers to the heavens. It's a really nice tradition. Okay, I guess that's it. No, maybe agriculture is your thing, and how they build up these various terraces to grow their potatoes and rice and things like that. So any of those are subjects that are fairly unequivocal, but this in its entirety, no, that's not really a compelling image. And I don't want to really spend my time jurying or trying to scrutinize an image that's not well visualized. Here's a shot along the Salt Lake River over on the Olympic Peninsula. The beautiful jade green water comes from a glacier way up the valley. It's in the spring. There's maples across the river. There's rocks with licorice ferns coming up. But again, this is not a shot. This is a shot. If you have to look, and maybe what was art after? Maybe there's a bird that we're not looking at. It has no subject. There's a subject within, a simple, elegant way that branch unfolds in front of that beautiful jade green. That's a subject. Here we're in Canyon de Chelly, late in the fall. It's brilliant colors, but it's bright sunshine. All right, so the complexity of that and the light, it just, for me, I'm hunting for a subject, but there's no real clear defined subject there. So I'm going to move in closer. Nope, still complex. Still, it's a mismatch. It's confusing. It's really not about texture. The light is modeled. It's really, if you're filling your frame with lights and darks, it becomes so complex, it's hard for the eye to reconcile it. And finally, just a simple few leaves, that's the subject. So I tend to simplify whatever I'm shooting, whether it's wildlife, culture, landscape. It should be unequivocal. You shouldn't be left wondering what the hell I'm trying to shoot. Unless, of course, it falls under the category, and I've done 2 books on camouflage, where I intentionally try to hide the subject in front of you. But that doesn't quite fall into this line of thought. So these are shots where I've ultimately gone to a stronger lens and simplified it and made it elegant in my mind and simple in my mind. I do a lot of bonsai work on pine trees in my garden in Seattle, and so I'm drawn towards the aesthetic and the graceful lines, and that's what I really emphasize when I'm spending weeks at a time stuck in the pine trees in Seattle. Just various simple lines, a bamboo in a forest where I was looking for tigers. You know, for a moment, the bamboo becomes the subject. I did a TV series called Travels to the Edge, and I can recall being in Japan. I've lined up a Buddhist monk. He's standing in socks and wooden sandals in a rapidly finishing up snowstorm outside the Shinto temple. Yeah, he's waiting for me. I've got an interpreter lined up. I'm going to go ask him some salient questions about his religion. And then I pass this. Up until this point, my color palette tended to be nature, you know, past not orange garish walls, but muted orange earth tones. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. But I looked at that, and for some kind of reason, it made me pause as I walked by, because, again, orange wasn't quite something that I ever considered, and yet I loved the way those black branches and that very delicate snow was layering on there without a breath of wind. So I passed it up, and then I'm almost at the monk, and then I thought, that is a fool's game. I went back, because if you think you're going to get it in 2 minutes, it's going to change, right? There's a reason Franz Lanting and I are neurotic, because everything changes fast. So you get it in the moment you see it. So I walked back, and I didn't shoot it this way, because what was the line of thought prior to this? It's too complex. There's a tree that's out of focus on the left. There's a wooden post on the right center. There's disruption. But this was the first grab shot, and then this is the shot I wound up with. So it's simpler, graphic, and I love it. And I'm forever love that color and that contrast. I went and finished the interview with the monk and came back to shoot more. A breath of wind came by, and all that delicate, dry snow was gone. And it was just dark limbs against the orange, and it was over. Here we are at Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone, shortly after the great fires of 1980 that ravaged much of Yellowstone. Grand Prismatic Spring, along with Old Faithful, are probably the 2 most iconic volcanic features of the entire ecosystem. So for a while, you could climb this hillside and look through the barren trees down at the spring. Today, it's a forest. This shot is long gone. But again, in this image, there's many things wrong with it. The horizon's down the middle. There's a diagonal tree pointing your eye out of the frame. There's a highway over on the right side. And if you squint your eyes, you would see Winnebagels in a parking lot way far away. So a shot like this is not what I would normally shoot. I've had to learn to shoot bad to emphasize the good. Do you know what I mean by that? When I give lectures, I've got to have stepping stones to the better ones, But both Franz and I and most successful professionals we're not making mistakes. We're just zeroing in on the salient image. But for teaching, you have to kind of step backwards and take some bad shots to actually show the series leading to the better one. Okay, so now we're putting on a telephoto from a 50 millimeter, and now it's simpler to look at the Grand Prismatic Spring, but then you see the sidewalks and people. And that's okay if it's a brochure for Yellowstone. But I like natural history, and I don't want the hand of man in it, and so I moved around, put even a stronger lens in, and now I was comparing and contrasting trees against the beautiful colors of that spring. And finally, I like this one. Very simple, very just swashes of color, very abstract. So there are reasons to put the subject in the middle. There are times where subjects in the middle are appropriate, most times not. Because as you look at this tree, I mean, it's so outlandish a tree would be in the ocean, right? That I put this tree right down the middle to emphasize how bizarre that would be. This is actually south of Charleston, and it's a whole coastline that's sinking because they put in some sort of bulkhead up the coast and changed the current, and the sand was washing away, and all the trees that were living were sinking into the ocean. But it just seemed that the tree itself was symmetrical, so horizons down the middle, subjects in the middle. But this is usually what most people do. I have a theory. Here's my theory. You're born, you eat, you go to the bathroom. The fourth thing is you get a camera, and the fifth thing is you put the subject in the middle. That's the very first 5 things of our lives. So why would putting the subject in the middle or the horizon in the middle be a bad thing? Because that's exactly where your eye goes and stops. And we want movement of the eye throughout the entirety of the image. Unless it's a shot where you're absolutely making a statement about how symmetrical, or this grove of trees in Tuscany, they look like a herd of sheep. And so I put them in the middle to emphasize the point. Symmetry is another way of putting the subject right down the middle. So these are intentionally using the balance of the subject in front of me to put the subject in the middle. But more times than not, I'll never do this unless is dictated by the subject. Okay? If there's a perfect reflection, yes, I'm going to put it down the middle. Okay, so to create a balanced composition is important. If you look at any famous artist from any of the genres, from Matisse to Jackson Pollock, Picasso, if you look at their canvases, they're filled with content. It's not by accident. They want your eye, as you look at their work, to move throughout the entirety of the composition. If it simply goes to the middle and stops, you want to move on. The trick as a photographer is to keep you engaged. Even if it's only for a couple seconds longer, that's worthy of the attempt. So we want your eye to move out and look and find subjects within it and keep finding it. Jackson Pollock famously said about his work is that where his painting ends, your imagination begins. When the subject or the horizon's in the middle, we tend to look straight at it, stop, recognize it, and move on. We're bored fast. So we want people that look at our work to remain engaged, even if it's for a few seconds. So to learn a subject, you try to teach it, right? And so I went out onto the Olympic Peninsula one year, and I piled up all these rounded rocks that had been formed by the millennia of wave action. And so I stacked up all these rocks, and these are several pounds each. I wanted to see if I had the manual dexterity to pile them up without crushing my toes. Okay, I did it. So there's two ways of balancing a composition. Positive and negative space. The subject and the background is another way of saying positive, negative space. Then the other way is filling the frame with content, with lines, textures, patterns. So these are the two different ways that I know of balancing the composition, using positive, negative space or filling the frame with very similar content. There's an Asian aesthetic of negative space, and it goes like this. The intensity of that Taj Mahal and the people, and then that dark space to the left, that vastness of that dark space has weight, and it balances the intensity of that much smaller object. So I often am using negative space in my images as well. So there's a balance in that. So, but this is where putting the subject in the middle, you see, I forget what this is, but that's where it is. And you look at it, there are a lot of secondary lines that move your eye around. This was shot up in Norway probably 5 years ago. It was a rounded cannonball with a rounded snow patch on it. And I put it in the middle just because it was everything was round and I wanted to overstate that. These are the pyramids in Egypt. They're the sailboats on a lake. They are, in short, your subject. That's what we do, all of us, initially as photographers. We put the subject in the middle with no consideration of the framing of it. That viewfinder that you're looking through is integral in relationship to the subject. And the more you think about that, the better off you will be and the stronger your compositions will be. For right now, the negative space, that dark space, overwhelms the subject, right? So the eye is kind of aimlessly wandering around the subject. So let's put a frame on that. Okay, so now we are defining it through the viewfinder that we're looking at. And still, that background's overwhelming. So the more you can make the background and the subject commensurate or even, the more graphic and pleasing it becomes. So in this case, what do? You either walk closer to the subject or put on a stronger lens. Regardless, it works when you make the background equal to the subject. Now the background's not just a big, vast black space, but it's triangles of black with triangles of white. And it's much more graphic and more interesting. And what happens? I mean, normally the negative space recedes and white areas come forward, and so often the positive is the bright. But what if the black is the positive? It's a silhouette, right? So what's really interesting is we read the white things coming forward. Other people may read the human silhouettes first. The thing that is the most remarkable is we can't perceive both at identical times. You have to switch back and forth instantly. No matter how intelligent we are, and you look like a really intelligent group of people because you're in this room and not in any of those other schmoes. But you can't read these things identical at the same time. Now, the artist that really inspired me when I was in college was M.C. Escher. And he was a master at playing with our brains. And he probably smoked a lot of pot because he was Dutch after all. But at the bottom of this illustration, you see a fish. And as you migrate north into the image, that fish becomes the background. So he was always playing with perceptions of positive and negative space. So is a zebra a dark animal with white stripes or a white animal? Forget about it. To learn this, I actually took a couple of my associates and friends, bought these hats and black vests and bow ties and put them in there and ripped some black paper up on the wall in my studio and tried to create something that I couldn't elaborate or enunciate very clearly. My intent was to align the lines and create drama within that. And again, without a pointer, and I don't have access to a pointer, but those diagonals we're trying to line up. For instance, the man in the lower left with all the freckles, his arm is lining up with that paper in the background. The more I could do that, the more I was learning how the subjects, and it's almost like Toulouse-Lautrec, who did these famous posters back in the 1800s. They were masters at using these lines and bringing things together. When I look at these sand dollars along a beach, the background is overwhelming the sand dollars. It's a very trite and very obvious image if you're going to shoot sand dollars. But that's not the way I was going to want to shoot it, because I look at those shapes between the sand dollars, and they're interesting. They've got triangular shapes. So the more I can train my eye to look beyond the obvious, the better I become as an observer. And if I become a better observer, I become a better composer of photography. And that's how I would have seen those. When you look at this image, it almost looks like a cartoon illustration. It really takes you back, and you look, what the hell is he showing us? Now I'm going to show you the way I shot it. Now, you may still not know where this is, but all of you would recognize it as some sort of structure. It won't give you pause. You know it's a silhouetted building of some sort. It happens to be in Mali, Africa, and that structure is a mosque made out of clay. So I'm always looking at the background and the subject and trying to bring them into a balance. What are we looking at here? We're looking at the tufas of Mono Lake. And now with color. So if the subject, the tufas, are interesting, then the background should be equally of interest. Back to those rocks on the coast. I'm pretty impressed. I did not break a toe balancing those rocks. All right, so then I got into Lightroom and I turned them into a black and white. My trick and my idea was then to make the white shapes between the black rocks become the subject. I had to train my eye to see it that way. Because I can articulate it, but I got to do it to really see it. And suddenly, every step left or right, forward or back, or if I twisted the camera, everything changed. But the white comes forward, the black recedes, and suddenly that background is as important as the subject. Again, as a teacher, I'm creating little lessons all along the way, and then I'm learning it that way. Then I can teach it. But it's not just for teaching a class. It goes on and beyond that, because once I start to teach it, then I start to see it. This shamrock shape, this thing that almost looks like a ginkgo leaf, is actually the space between two rocks out in Utah. So I'm always now scrutinizing a subject and looking for the potential. Because we all see the mountains at sunset and the reflections, but life should be a lot more than just beautiful mountains like we just saw in the last lecture, which were extraordinary. But to find the details and, more importantly, to find the elements that most people step on or dismiss before they even consider, that's the mark of a keen observer and a better scrutinizer, a better photographer. So a herd of elephants in Botswana, okay, I'm going to shoot it this way, but then I'm going to start to look at the shapes, the silhouettes of their legs. And maybe I'll shoot it this way, but ultimately, maybe I'll zoom in. And this is a little more interesting, because you get to the point that it's elephants, but it's not overtly obvious. You have to struggle just a little bit to kind of recognize. And it really is a study of positive and negative space. Those shapes around that elephant calf have interesting shapes. Okay, now listen, if you still are not following my line of thought, then this might make it easier. I took a couple of my friends out to the beach. And I put them in these hats, and I said, okay, guys, vogue it. And they go, what? I said, Bend your elbows and your knees. Okay. They did. But now your eye can navigate over the top of them. So if I zoom in a little tighter and crop right at the top of their hats, then I'm locking your eye into different positions. Now I'm creating spaces, triangles between their legs. This becomes more graphically pleasing than that. Do you all see that? So that's what I'm looking at. I'm always trying to turn something into a little more graphic, something more stylish, something more memorable. That's the challenge for me as I travel the world. I was down in Havana, Cuba, and there's these muscle-bound guys talking to some friends in the lower left. You know, I take a lot of portraits where I'm asking permission to take portraits, but there's a lot of times where I'm shooting candid shots, where I don't want any kind of interconnection with the subject because I want to observe from afar with a telephoto lens. So they had no idea I was in the shadows photographing them. But right now, this photo pretty much sucks. You can't really perceive the people on the lower left. They're in the shadows. The space between the two guys aren't all that interesting. I don't even think the horizon's straight. So all I did was turn my camera into a vertical and slightly move to the right to close the gap between them. And I'm not saying this is a great shot, but it's by far more engaging. Because now the relationship between these two guys is unequivocal. The space between them works, whereas in the previous incarnation it did not. Which leads to this or that. So yeah, I mean, for the longest time when stock was a viable way of making money, my work sold quite well because it's graphic, it's easy to understand, there was no question marks. I've been to Africa probably 50 times over the years. I'll be there next week. One year, I took a white sheet from my house and a dedicated black Leica camera called a monogram, I guess. And I photographed these Maasai. These are Morani. These young Maasai are going through rites of passage from puberty until they get married. They are decorated like peacocks. They've got beautiful hairstyles, got a lot of beads. They aren't obligated to work. The best time of their life is from puberty until they get married. And when they get married, then their life is over as they know it. So I shot it that way. But then I took two of them and I framed it and I stylized it. And that gap between their hair and the way I cropped it at the top of their head was intentional. I want to lock in shapes around it, and their spears then filled in that gap. As much as I can with a simple subject, I try to turn it into a very stylized but graphic image. Dancers in Havana, Cuba, just looking straight down on their feet. The way this baboon is moving up a tree. It's all about studying the light and the dark, the composition, the lines. This lady was at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Unbeknownst, she didn't know I was photographing her, but I loved the triangles in her arms and her knee, and lost in thought. It was just a perfect subject, and I was far enough away that I didn't really intrude upon her. A shrine in Bali is intrusions of blue into the outline of the shrine, and that pigeon serves as scale. So I'm always looking at a subject, and is there a more graphic way of portraying the subject with the background? This is a Mani stone in central Mongolia, and it's shot with a fill and flash right at sunset. The top of it was not perfect. It was kind of at an angle. And just the history of this is that for the longest time, they thought these Mani stones were markers across a vast open grassland. In fact, Mongolia is the least populated country on earth. Okay, so that's the way I shot it, but then I thought there's got to be a better way, a more graphic way. So the next day I walked up to it, and that's the way the top was. But what if I zoomed in and lowered my perspective and removed the horizon that you see on the lower right? Then I could turn it into a pyramid. That's much more graphic and intriguing than the previous incarnation. So it's totally wrong the way it actually was situated in the land, but this became a little more graphic, turned into black and white. So, it's funny how all of us, when we hold a camera, we are holding the camera and looking at the vertical lines. But I teach a lot of workshops on photography as art in degraded environments, from Detroit to Astoria, Oregon to Atlanta, where we go into marginal neighborhoods and we find Jackson Pollocks and William de Koonings and Mark Rothko's, these abstract expressionists. But there are a lot of times where you turn the camera at a 45-degree angle and it opens up the subject. But we're so wired to shoot straight up and down. This was shot at a 45-degree angle. I'm working on a book called Fire and Ice. So I've been traveling the world looking for volcanoes, from Iceland to Indonesia, all over the world. But I'm also shooting the details in the same way I've been talking and teaching all morning, into the subject. The bright areas of the lava coming out of the earth are the subject, but the background is triangular shapes as well. Intrusions of light into dark and dark into light. So this is an aerial shot over Lake Iliamna, myriad of islands. How to photograph it? It's finding a balance between the light and the dark, the positive and negative. Aerial shots over the Palouse, this farmland in eastern Washington. It's an extraordinary landscape, by the way, if you've not been out there. They cannot irrigate this land. It's a very undulating landscape made of ancient volcanic ash. But it's beautiful the way they grow winter wheat and cut it, and from the air it becomes this amazing landscape, as you see. But constantly, as you're flying through, you're judging the composition. I did a body of work called The Human Canvas, and I'm applying the same things that I was before: positive, negative space. This body of work was playing with gender, race, sexual identity. I turned black guys white and white guys black and just played with people's perceptions on that. Because I started doing that with the tribal work in the mountains of New Guinea years before. And here, it's so complex with lights and darks, I wanted you to struggle a little bit to see where the hands are, where heads are. I wanted to overwhelm you so that it required a second and a third and a fourth glance. There was a reason that Edward Weston and Ansel Adams flocked to the sand dunes of Death Valley, because, Ansel photographed Yosemite and very recognizable land formations, but in the sand dunes of Death Valley, it was more free. They could be abstracting and getting shots that were not recognizable anywhere else. So these are just shots of landscapes that I'm framing in different ways just to see if it works. Lights and darks, shadows and light. This is a tribe down in Ethiopia, and I'm on the dark side of it. The sun is setting on the other side, and so I started shooting. I've already got them from the other side with color and texture of the skin and all of those kind of shots. Then I got on the dark side, underexposed, and then started clicking away. And this was one of my favorite shots, simply because of the hands above the character on center right. That's a beautiful way of portraying hands and bodies, and the space between the two guys to the left has interesting shapes. And again, it's all in the moment. It's changing radically. I'm shooting really quick, but ultimately one or two shots work in a shot like that, which then I apply back in my studio in Seattle, playing with perceptions. So these are all examples of positive, negative space that I've shot over the years, pulling it out of my archive. Just, they're funny or they're different, they're graphic. Monks in Myanmar walking in their shadows on the slick stone. Okay, so the other way of creating a balanced comp is filling the frame. So if you're a geologist walking along Point Lobos in California, you may be, as a geologist, intrigued on those orange minerals leaching out of the rock, right? That would be of interest to you as a geologist. But from an artist's point of view, dark areas on the margins weaken the image. So as an artist, I would shoot it very differently. Maybe I would go in, twist the camera around, and play with those lines. And having lines come out of a corner is the way we read. In Western culture, we read bottom to top, left to right. And so your eye access moves along those lines, and as much as I could, I filled the frame with content. And is it the only way? No, there's a lot of rocks out there the same way, and these are various versions of the same idea, filling the frame with content. Again, this is out of whack. This is a little more graphic and well seen. There's more balance to this composition. Here's an old train car in Astoria, Oregon. That's not the way I would shoot it. I would zoom in, turn the angle, crop it into a panoramic, saturate the color, and it becomes more interesting that way. So balanced composition, filling the frame with content, every part of that composition in Croatia delivers content. So your eye moves throughout that composition. This is one of my favorite shots. I don't know if it translates on a small screen, but this is a volcanic landscape in central Iceland. Imagine, if you will, this landscape without that snow patch in the lower right. It would be totally out of balance. But that snow patch holds that corner. And this was actually made with vertical redundant photos. In other words, I stitched together about 8 verticals. But what I loved about this landscape was it was volcanic, and so there's no hard edges in it. And all that blue that you perceive is actually ash that's fallen on snow. There was an ash eruption. So it wasn't really blue, but with distance, it appears to be blue. And so blue and orange are complementary colors. The rounded formation of the earth becomes more of a watercolor painting. And for me, the more my work looks like a painting, the happier I am, because that's, of course, my history. I call this lifelines. This is a Japanese maple in the Arboretum. Again, with a 15 millimeter lens, I'm struggling to have all those lines reach out to all 4 corners of the composition as much as I could. So all of these are intentional, looking at every part of the frame and finding a way to make it even. This was one of my favorite places. This was a lake on the outside of Kyoto, Japan. And it was on a very calm morning at a small pond that had all these lotus stems. And lotus stems go, 4 or 5 feet tall. They're very delicate, but after a long winter, they're broken and bent. And on a calm morning, everywhere they bend to the surface, they create these really nice shapes. I was channeling Keith Haring. You know, Keith Haring was this artist that drew, but his lines never intersected each other, and that's what I was trying to do. Every step right or left opened up the space between the lines or closed them off. So all of these are just versions of the same idea, filling the frame with content. So negative space, putting the subject off center. Right now, we've got the subject right in the middle. That's where your eye goes and stops. A wider angle allows an environment to be brought into it. You still have the waterfall, but there's a balance between the distant waterfall and the luxuriant forest of Mount Rainier National Park surrounding it. I mean, there's sunsets, rainbows, and waterfalls are things that everybody wants to shoot, but they become so trite So trying to photograph a waterfall in a different way is the challenge. This is an iPhone shot in the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. So I was just playing with negative space, again, with that white wall. So all these are negative space. That vastness of the sand dune and those camel drivers are balanced, or so I hope. This is one of my favorite shots, and do you think I just stopped the car and shot that? No, when I saw it, it was like this. The animal was not lined up with that, and so I ran up the road, lined it up with that slope, zoomed in so that you don't see the texture of grass on the sand dune or the sky. That doesn't quite work. That's better. And that's my favorite. So it's just finding and fine-tuning, placing my body where it should be. I mean, it's really negative space, right? The convergence of the shadow and the light and that Bisa oryx all come together and creates kind of an unorthodox image of an animal. So I'm always looking for ways of putting that subject off-center, playing with negative space. And a lot of that really came from the years of working with Audubon magazine here in New York. For the longest time, it was one of the best nature magazines out there. Les Lyon, the editor, put a lot of money into the reproductions, and they had these wraparound covers. And I was always shooting for wraparound covers. And so an eagle like that, I knew the spine of the magazine could be in those dark cottonwood trees. But it trained me to always look for ways of putting the subject on one end or the other. So yeah, I mean, whenever there's beautiful symmetry, if you travel into Tuscany, Italy, you have all these beautiful roads going up to these castles with the way they plant the trees is wonderful. But there's other ways of showing symmetry. This is my long-term assistant, Gabriel Jacan. He's worked with me for 30 years. Up until this unfortunate moment. We had a little tremor. There was a slight tremor, and those rocks came and crushed him to death. But we had a good relationship before that. I was in Myanmar, and there was this monk, and he was wearing this golden robe, and there was this golden medallion on the edge of the monastery wall. He was standing, and his head was way above the center of the medallion, and I tried to coax him through the interpreter to bend down so that his head would come out of the center. They were jabbering back and forth, and I said, is he going to do it? No, he doesn't want to do it. I said, come on, he's Myanmar, he's Buddhist, they've got to do these things. And then after 10 minutes of going back and forth, then he gives me that smile, and then he said to me in perfect English, why don't you Photoshop me into place? I kid you not. I kid you not. Then he did it. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.